The dust-laden wind carried whispers through Dustwood Valley as Ethan Mitchell guided his horse down the winding trail. 10 months had passed since he'd found Anna lying cold in their Flagstaff home, her golden hair spread across the floorboards like spilled wheat. The memory haunted him still, driving him ever southward until he'd stumbled upon the listing for this forgotten ranch. 500 acres of promise tucked away where Arizona territory met Mexico's northern reach. Through his grimy spectacles, Ethan studied the weather-beaten deed he'd purchased from a shifty-eyed banker in Globe. The price had been suspiciously low for such a vast property, but desperation had a way of quieting doubt. Besides, he needed somewhere to rebuild, somewhere far from the pitying glances and whispered condolences that had driven him from Flagstaff like a man pursued. The valley opened before him as his horse crested the final ridge, revealing a sprawling adobe ranch house nestled against red cliff walls. Ancient cottonwoods cast long shadows across the yard, their leaves rattling like dry bones in the evening breeze. But something wasn't right. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm lamplight glowed in the windows. Impossible, since the property had supposedly stood abandoned for years. Drawing his Winchester from its scabbard, Ethan approached cautiously. The front door creaked open before he reached it, spilling golden light across the packed earth. 3 women stood in the doorway, arranged like steps, the tallest in back, the shortest in front. Their dresses were oddly formal for the frontier, all black lace and high collars that belonged in some eastern parlor rather than this desolate valley. "Welcome home, Mr. Mitchell," said the eldest, her silver-streaked hair gleaming in the lamplight. Helen Turner was her name, she explained, and these were her sisters, Frances and Clara. They'd been watching over the property, though she didn't elaborate on whose authority. Their smiles never quite reached their eyes, which seemed to shift color like desert mirages. That first night, they insisted he take the master bedroom upstairs, though Ethan would have preferred to sleep in the barn. The sisters moved through the house like shadows, their footsteps impossibly light on the creaking floorboards. He lay awake listening to their whispered conversations in a language he didn't recognize, musical and ancient sounding. Clara, the youngest, brought him coffee at dawn. She perched on the edge of his bed with unsettling familiarity, her dark eyes holding promises that made his blood run both hot and cold. "The land remembers," she murmured, trailing fingers across his chest. "It knows what belongs and what doesn't." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of sage and something metallic. Frances spoke in riddles while they worked the corrals that afternoon, her words twisting like the desert heat waves. "Time flows differently here," she said, plaiting her copper-colored hair. "The past and future blend like watercolors, Mr. Mitchell. Your wife understood that before." He nearly dropped the hammer he was holding. He hadn't mentioned Anna to anyone since arriving. Helen watched it all from the wraparound porch, her knitting needles clicking like cicada wings. When darkness fell, she finally spoke plainly. "You should leave, Mr. Mitchell. The deed means nothing. This land has belonged to our family since before your people knew it existed. When the moon is full again, everything changes." But there was nowhere left to go, and something about the sisters' mysterious presence drew him like a moth to flame. That night, Ethan discovered the hidden room behind the kitchen pantry, its walls covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the lantern light. Photographs scattered across a dusty table showed faces he recognized. His wife Anna, smiling beside the 3 sisters in front of this very house. The images had yellowed with age, but that was impossible. Anna had never been to this valley, had she? The more he searched, the more questions arose. Old letters mentioned a Phillips family curse, stretching back to when the first Spanish missionaries tried to claim this land. Other documents hinted at something older still, something that had walked these hills long before Europeans arrived. The sisters were woven through it all, their faces unchanged across decades of faded photographs. In the darkest hours before dawn, Clara would sing from somewhere in the house, her voice carrying impossible harmonies that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Francis left cryptic warnings carved into his saddle leather and scrawled in the margins of his Bible. Helen simply watched, her ageless eyes holding secrets that made his skin crawl. Each passing day drew him deeper into their web, even as his instincts screamed at him to flee. But the truth was, Ethan Mitchell had nowhere else to go. The ranch offered a chance to start over, to build something meaningful from the ashes of his old life. If that meant facing whatever ancient power held sway over this valley, so be it. He had already lost everything once. What more could these strange sisters possibly take from him? The morning brought no relief from the oppressive heat that had settled over Dustwood Valley. Ethan found himself studying an ancient map he'd discovered tucked behind loose boards in the ranch house's study. Its yellowed edges crumbled at his touch, but the faded ink lines traced something familiar, a network of caves that honeycombed the valley's northern ridge. He remembered Helen mentioning those caves in passing, her voice carrying an edge of warning that he'd chosen to ignore. A letter from the previous owner, dated 1873, caught his attention. Alexander Wright had written frantically about voices in the stone and lights that dance without flame. The man had fled to Prescott shortly after, selling the ranch for a fraction of its worth. But what truly chilled Ethan was the sketch in the margin. 3 female figures standing before the cave entrance, their features eerily similar to the sisters who now haunted his days. Frances appeared at his shoulder without warning, making him start. She studied the map with knowing eyes, her finger tracing the cave system's outline. "The old ones marked these paths," she murmured. "Before the Spanish, before the Apache. They knew what slept beneath." Her riddles had grown more pointed lately, as if time itself were running short. Clara's laughter drifted through the open window, drawing Ethan's attention to the garden where she tended strange flowers that bloomed despite the drought. Their petals held colors he'd never seen in nature, shifting like oil on water in the harsh sunlight. She caught his gaze and smiled, but there was something predatory in the gesture that made him look away. That afternoon, he rode out to the caves, ignoring the warnings that echoed in his mind. The entrance was smaller than the map suggested, barely large enough for a man to pass through. Ancient symbols had been carved into the rock face, spirals and curved lines that seemed to move in his peripheral vision. A cool breeze carried the scent of earth and something else, something sweet and metallic that made his horse stamp nervously. Inside, the passage widened into a chamber where light filtered through cracks in the ceiling. More symbols covered the walls, and at the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what Ethan refused to identify. Scattered around it were objects that defied time: Spanish coins, Apache arrowheads, and pieces of delicate pottery that seemed to hum when he approached. Helen found him there as sunset painted the sky blood red. She stood in the chamber's entrance, her silhouette impossibly tall. "You're looking in the wrong direction," she said softly. "The truth isn't in these caves, Ethan Mitchell. It's in the blood that runs through your veins." She stepped closer, and for a moment her face seemed to shift, revealing something ancient and terrible beneath her human mask. Back at the ranch, Ethan pored over his family records late into the night. His grandfather had passed through this valley decades ago, staying just long enough to leave a cryptic warning in his journal about the women who guard the gate. The same grandfather who disappeared near Globe, leaving behind only a silver pendant that now hung around Ethan's neck. The pendant caught the lamplight, and for the first time, Ethan noticed the symbols etched into its surface. The same symbols that marked the cave walls. Understanding began to dawn, heavy and cold in his gut. He wasn't here by chance. The sisters hadn't simply allowed him to stay, they had been waiting for him, waiting for the blood that ran in his veins, waiting for something he'd carried without knowing. Outside, the moon rose full and swollen over Dustwood Valley. Clara's voice began its nightly song, but now he could hear the words clearly, an ancient language that stirred memories he'd never lived. Frances's warnings took on new meaning, and Helen's gaze held not just secrets but recognition. The ranch wasn't just sitting on cursed land, it was a doorway, and his bloodline held the key. Thunder rolled across the valley, though no clouds marred the star-strewn sky. The sisters' voices joined in harmony, calling him to step outside to embrace the legacy he'd inherited. Ethan touched the pendant at his throat and felt it pulse like a second heartbeat. He knew then that his wife's murder hadn't been random. It had been the first step on a path that led him here, to this moment, to this choice. The first rays of dawn painted long shadows across Ethan Mitchell's weathered face as he studied the peculiar markings carved into his barn door. They weren't there the evening before, intricate spirals and unfamiliar symbols that made his skin crawl. 2 weeks had passed since he'd purchased the derelict ranch in Dustwood Valley, and each morning brought new mysteries that tested his resolve to stay. Helen Turner, the eldest of the 3 sisters, watched him from the edge of the property, her silver-streaked hair catching the early light. She hadn't aged a day since his arrival, yet something in her eyes spoke of centuries. When she approached, the air grew thick with the scent of sage and iron. The land speaks through ancient tongues, she said, running her fingers along the carvings. It remembers what was stolen. Frances, the middle sister, emerged from the mist that perpetually shrouded the western pasture. Her dress, though perfectly tailored, seemed to shift colors like desert sand at sunset. "Brother Ethan," she called, her voice musical yet discordant, "have you counted your cattle today? Numbers hold power here." The question sent a chill down his spine. He'd lost 3 head of cattle in the past week, finding only scattered bones bleached white by an impossible sun. Clara, the youngest, drifted closer than her sisters dared, her presence both alluring and terrifying. Unlike her siblings, she made no pretense of maintaining distance. "Your wife Anna would have understood this place," she whispered, though he'd never told them about Anna. She had the sight, didn't she? Before they silenced her in Globe? The mention of his murdered wife made Ethan's hand instinctively reach for his revolver. The sisters had begun appearing more frequently since he'd discovered the sealed cellar beneath the old barn. Its heavy door, bound with strips of copper and strange minerals, refused to yield to his tools. Each night he heard singing from below, 3 voices weaving harmonies that didn't follow any earthly scale. The cattle grew restless on these nights, and the moon cast shadows that moved against the wind. Benjamin Roberts, the only neighbor within 20 miles, had warned him about the property's history when Ethan first arrived from Prescott. "That land belonged to the Turner family since before recorded memory," he'd said, nervously glancing over his shoulder. "They say the original deed was written in blood, not ink. The sisters are its guardians, not its owners. There's a difference that matters." The truth began unraveling when Ethan discovered his wife's journal hidden among her belongings. Anna's elegant script filled pages with accounts of her investigations into the Turner sisters and their connection to a series of disappearances around Globe. She'd traced their lineage through courthouse records that somehow spanned 2 centuries, always 3 sisters, always the same names. Late one evening, as Ethan pored over Anna's research by lamplight, Frances appeared in his doorway uninvited. "Your wife was clever," she mused, "following the breadcrumbs we left. But she asked the wrong questions. It's not about who we are, Ethan Mitchell, it's about what we guard." The air crackled with static electricity as she spoke, and his lamp flickered in response to some unseen force. The ranch's peculiarities intensified with each passing day. Water from the well ran clear but left iridescent patterns on metal surfaces. Crops in the small garden grew overnight, producing vegetables with subtle geometric patterns beneath their skin. Even the stars seemed wrong. Constellations shifted when he wasn't looking directly at them, forming arrangements that made his head ache if he studied them too long. Helen's warnings became more urgent as the full moon approached. "There are doors that should remain closed," she told him one morning. "Your wife found one in Globe." Her death wasn't murder. It was containment. The revelation struck Ethan like a physical blow. He'd spent 3 years hunting phantoms, seeking vengeance against imagined assassins, while the true nature of Anna's death remained hidden behind a veil of supernatural necessity. The middle sister's riddles began to align with Anna's journal entries. Frances spoke of the thin places where boundaries blurred, and Anna had mapped similar locations across the territory. The ranch sat at the center of her calculations, a nexus point where multiple lines of power converged. Whatever lay beneath the sealed cellar connected to something vast and ancient, something the Turner sisters had been containing for generations. Clara, the youngest sister, began appearing in Ethan's dreams, her whispers carrying promises that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself. During his waking hours, he found himself drawn to the sealed cellar door, studying the strange symbols carved into its weathered planks. They resembled the markings in Anna's journal, but distorted, as if viewed through rippling water. The more he examined them, the more they seemed to pulse with an inner light that left after-images dancing behind his closed eyelids. Francis took to leaving cryptic drawings on his doorstep each morning, intricate geometric patterns that matched the cellar door's markings but contained additional layers of complexity. When he finally confronted her about them, she merely smiled and said, "The patterns remember what we choose to forget." Your Anna understood this before the end. The mention of his wife's name sent a familiar ache through his chest, but now it carried a different weight. One afternoon, while repairing fence posts on the property's eastern edge, Ethan discovered a collection of sun-bleached bones arranged in a perfect spiral. They weren't animal remains. The shapes were too alien, too angular to have belonged to any creature he'd ever encountered. Helen appeared beside him as he knelt to examine them, her presence as silent as a shadow. "The land remembers," she said, her voice carrying the dry whisper of autumn leaves. "It holds on to things that should have stayed buried in Prescott." The mention of Prescott triggered another memory from Anna's journal. She'd written about a cave system there, sealed by the territorial authorities after a series of unexplained disappearances. The connections were beginning to form, like constellations emerging from a chaos of stars. Whatever force lay beneath the ranch had tendrils reaching across the territory, and Anna had been mapping its influence before her death. As the full moon drew closer, the landscape itself seemed to shift and breathe. Ethan would wake to find the distant hills had changed position overnight, or catch glimpses of impossible colors bleeding through the sunrise. The Turner sisters moved through these alterations with practiced ease, adjusting their daily routines as if dancing to music only they could hear. Their calm acceptance of the impossible made everything more unsettling. Clara's nightly visits grew more intense, her seductive whispers now carrying fragments of truth about Anna's final days. She spoke of a discovery in Globe, of ancient knowledge that had driven his wife to seek out the ranch's secrets. "She came here looking for answers," Clara murmured against his ear one night, her breath impossibly cold. "But some questions shouldn't be asked, and some doors shouldn't be opened, even when they call your name." The middle sister's riddles began taking on a desperate edge. Frances would corner him in the barn or by the well, her eyes wild with urgency as she spoke of the thinning time and the hunger beneath. Her cryptic warnings always circled back to Anna's research, suggesting that his wife's death had been part of a larger pattern, a cycle that was approaching its peak as the full moon neared. Helen's presence became more commanding, her authority radiating like heat from a forge. She spoke of responsibilities passed down through generations of Turner women, of sacrifices made to maintain boundaries that existed long before white settlers arrived in the territory. The ranch, she explained, wasn't just property. It was a seal, a cork in a bottle containing something vast and hungry and patient. The truth of Anna's death began to crystallize in Ethan's mind. She hadn't been murdered by random outlaws as he'd believed. She'd discovered something in her research, something that connected Globe to Prescott, and finally to this remote ranch in Dustwood Valley. The Turner sisters hadn't killed her, but they knew why she had to die. The same force that had claimed Anna was now calling to him through the cellar door, through Clara's midnight whispers, through the shifting landscape itself. As the full moon approached, Ethan realized he faced a choice that was no choice at all. He could flee, abandoning the ranch to whatever lay beneath it, or he could stay and face the truth about Anna's death, and perhaps about the nature of reality itself. The Turner sisters watched him with their unsettling calm, knowing his decision had been made the moment he first set foot on their land. The ranch's secrets had already claimed him, just as they had claimed his wife before him. The full moon drew closer as Ethan began methodically exploring the ranch's sprawling acreage, searching for clues about Anna's research. In his saddlebags, he'd found her old journal, its pages filled with cryptic sketches of strange geometric patterns she'd discovered carved into rocks throughout the territory. The same symbols now caught his eye, etched into the weathered fence posts and foundation stones of the ranch house, their edges worn smooth by decades of desert winds. Frances, the middle sister, took to following him at a distance as he worked, her bare feet somehow leaving no prints in the dusty soil. When he'd ask about the symbols, she'd only respond with verses from songs he'd never heard, her voice carrying on the wind like a mourning dove's call. "The land remembers what we forget," she'd say, "and forgets what we remember." In Globe, Ethan found records indicating the ranch had belonged to a family named Turner since before Arizona was a territory, but the documents showed only brothers, no sisters. The full moon cast an eerie glow across the Dustwood Valley as Ethan Mitchell stood on his newly purchased ranch's porch, the worn boards creaking beneath his boots. The three sisters, Helen, Frances, and Clara Turner, sat in rocking chairs before him, their ethereal beauty somehow enhanced by the ghostly light. His hand instinctively touched the deed in his pocket, but the paper felt worthless now as Helen, the eldest, fixed him with eyes that seemed to glow like amber coals. "You've ignored our warnings, Mr. Mitchell," Helen said, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the nightbirds fall silent. "The moon is full, and now you'll witness what that means in Dustwood Valley." Frances, the middle sister, smiled cryptically as she wove intricate patterns in the air with her fingers, leaving trailing wisps of silver light that hung suspended like spider's silk. Clara, the youngest, rose from her chair with fluid grace that seemed impossible for any mortal woman. She stepped toward Ethan, her bare feet leaving frost patterns on the wooden boards despite the summer heat. "We tried to seduce you away with gentler methods," she whispered, close enough now that her breath chilled his skin. "But you men of Prescott never could resist claiming what isn't yours to take." The temperature plunged as Helen joined her sister, the air around them shimmering with an ancient power that made Ethan's teeth ache. "This land belonged to our mother's mother and her mother before her," Helen intoned. "We are its guardians, bound by blood and oath to protect it from those who would tame it with fences and furrows." Frances began to sing in a language Ethan had never heard, her voice weaving through the night air like smoke. The ground trembled beneath their feet as shapes emerged from the shadows. Spectral forms of women spanning generations, all bearing the same otherworldly beauty as the sisters. They formed a circle around the porch, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. "Your wife's death brought you here seeking solace," Clara said, genuine sympathy in her voice. "But this land offers no peace to men like you, Ethan Mitchell. It demands sacrifice, as it has from every generation of our family." The ghostly figures began to move in a slow, hypnotic dance, their movements stirring up dust devils that glowed with an inner light. Memories of Anna, his murdered wife, flooded Ethan's mind, but they felt different now, tainted by some ancient magic that revealed hidden truths. He saw her as she truly was. Not the innocent victim he'd believed, but one of them. A Turner sister from generations past who'd tried to escape her heritage, only to be reclaimed by the land's inexorable pull. "She never told you what she was," Helen said, reading his thoughts. "She thought she could live as a mortal, build a normal life in Flagstaff. But the land called her home in the end, as it calls all of us." The spectral dancers moved closer, their ethereal forms beginning to merge with the sisters, lending them an even more terrifying beauty. Frances stepped forward, her riddles finally taking clear shape. "The deed you hold was signed in blood long ago, Ethan Mitchell. Not with ink on paper, but with the sacrifices of our ancestors. The land remembers, and it chooses its own." The paper in his pocket burst into blue flames, crumbling to ash that swirled away on the supernatural wind. The truth hit Ethan like a physical blow. He hadn't chosen this ranch by chance. The land had called him here, using his grief as a beacon. Anna's death hadn't been a random act of violence in Yuma. It had been the land reclaiming one of its own. And now it had drawn him into its web of ancient magic and family obligations. Clara's next words confirmed his realization. "You have a choice now, as Anna did before you. Join us, bind yourself to this land and its power, or face the consequences of trespassing on sacred ground." The ghostly figures pressed closer, their combined energy making the air crack with electricity. In their faces, Ethan saw echoes of Anna, understanding at last the weight of the heritage she'd tried to escape. Helen raised her hands, and the land itself seemed to respond, the earth rippling like water, ancient power surging up through the soil. "The moon is full, the barriers between worlds are thin, and the time of choice is upon you," she declared. "Will you embrace the legacy that brought you here, or will you force us to defend what has always been ours?" Ethan felt the power calling to him, singing in his blood with the same voice that had drawn him to this valley. He understood now that buying the ranch had never been about starting over. It had been about coming home to a destiny he'd never known was his. The choice before him would change everything, but in truth, it had been made long ago when he first fell in love with Anna Turner. The ancient power surged through Ethan's veins as he faced Helen and her sisters, his heart pounding with the rhythm of the earth itself. The memory of Anna's final words before her murder suddenly crystallized. She hadn't been delirious with fever as he'd thought, but trying to tell him about her true heritage, about the sisters who guarded the valley's secrets. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ranch yard as he made his choice. "I understand now," he said, his voice steady despite the supernatural energies crackling around them. "Anna wasn't just my wife. She was one of you, a guardian who tried to escape this legacy. But in running, she brought me right back to where I needed to be." Frances stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light as she studied him with new interest. Clara's ethereal form shifted like smoke in the wind as she circled him, her whispered words carrying ancient power. The blood price must still be paid. Anna's choice had consequences that reached beyond death itself. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and in the distance coyotes howled with unnaturally human voices. Helen raised her hands higher, and the very air seemed to bend around them. You carry part of her now, marked by love and death. The land recognizes its own. The ranch house groaned behind them, weathered boards creaking as though awakening from a long slumber. Through the windows, Ethan could see strange lights dancing, like memories trying to take physical form. There were others before Anna who tried to break free, Frances explained, her riddling speech finally clear. Each time the land drew them back one way or another. The Turner bloodline has guarded this valley since before the first settlers arrived from Flagstaff, before the territory lines were drawn with mortal hands. Ethan felt the truth of it in his bones as the power continued to build. The ranch wasn't just land. It was a nexus, a meeting point between worlds that needed protection. Anna had understood this, even as she'd tried to escape it. Her death hadn't been random violence as he'd believed, but the work of those who'd long sought to claim the valley's power for themselves. The men who killed Anna, he said, realization dawning. They knew what she was. What this place is? Clara nodded solemnly, her form becoming more solid as the moon reached its apex. The night air filled with whispers in languages long forgotten by the living. Helen stepped forward, extending her hand. The choice remains yours, but know this. Accepting your place here means more than simply owning land. You'll become part of an ancient trust, bound to powers older than the nation itself. The price is high, but the alternative? She glanced meaningfully at the shadows gathering at the edge of the property where hungry eyes gleamed in the darkness. The decision crystallized in Ethan's mind as he remembered Anna's smile, her quiet strength, the way she'd always seemed to know more than she said. He reached out and took Helen's hand, feeling the surge of power flow between them like lightning. The earth itself seemed to sigh in relief as ancient magics recognized a new guardian. Frances and Clara moved to form a circle around them, their combined energies creating a vortex of supernatural force that lifted dust and debris into the air. The ranch house shimmered, its true nature revealing itself. Not just weathered wood and nails, but a fortress built on foundations of power and sacrifice. The men who killed Anna will return, Clara warned, her seductive whispers now carrying the weight of prophecy. They've waited generations to claim this power, watching from the shadows between Globe and Prescott, gathering their strength. But now you stand with us, brother by marriage, guardian by choice. Together, Helen intoned, we protect not just this land, but the barriers between worlds. Welcome home, Ethan Turner. As she spoke his name, Anna's name, the power sealed itself within him, transforming him into something more than human, less than divine, but perfectly suited to his new purpose. The moon began its descent, and with it, the supernatural energy ebbed like a tide, leaving Ethan forever changed. He looked at his new sisters with clear eyes, understanding at last that his journey to the Dustwood Valley hadn't been an escape from his past, but a return to a destiny written in blood and starlight long before his birth. The transformation coursed through Ethan's veins like liquid moonlight, burning away the last vestiges of his mortal uncertainties. Dawn painted the Dustwood Valley in shades of amber and rose, but he could now see the otherworldly shimmer that lay beneath the mundane. Ancient wards etched in starfire, binding this realm to others far more terrible and beautiful than he'd ever imagined. Helen approached him, her tall form casting no shadow in the emerging light. "They're coming from Globe," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Alexander leads them, the same bloodline that's hunted our kind since before the territory lines were drawn. He was there the night Anna died, though you never saw his face." Clara's fingers traced patterns in the dust, leaving trails of ghostly light. "7 riders," she whispered, her eyes distant. "They carry iron forged in hatred and silver, blessed by fallen priests. But they don't know what you've become, brother." The full moon cast an ethereal glow across Dustwood Valley as Ethan Mitchell stood before the 3 sisters for what he knew would be the final confrontation. Clara, the eldest, watched him with eyes that seemed to glow like embers in the darkness. Helen, ever enigmatic, swayed slightly as if moved by an unseen wind. And Frances, the youngest whose whispered promises had nearly driven him mad these past weeks, smiled with teeth that gleamed too sharp in the moonlight. "You were warned," Clara spoke, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "This land remembers what your kind did here. The massacre of our mother's people, the desecration of sacred ground. Yet you chose to stay to dig up what should have remained buried. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something older, something that made Ethan's skin crawl. The truth had come to him piece by piece over the past month. The mysterious disappearances of previous owners, the strange markings carved into the bedroom walls of the old ranch house, the way the cattle would go mad on certain nights, throwing themselves against the fences until their skulls cracked. His wife Anna's murder hadn't been random. She'd been researching the history of Dustwood Valley, uncovering secrets about the land's original inhabitants. Helen stepped forward, her silver hair floating around her face like a living thing. "The barrier grows thin tonight," she said in her maddening riddles. "When moon meets earth, when above touches below, when the veil parts like gossamer wings." She reached out one pale hand, and Ethan felt something ancient and terrible stirring beneath his feet. The ground itself seemed to pulse with dark energy. Frances circled behind him, her breath warm against his neck. "You could still join us, my love," she whispered. "Let the old magic take you, transform you. Become something more than human." Her words carried the same seductive power that had nearly broken his will on so many nights. But Ethan had made his choice. He wouldn't abandon the truth Anna died trying to uncover. "I know what you are," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "The original people of this valley didn't just disappear. They made a pact with something ancient, something that lived in the depths of the earth. They became guardians, protectors, but at a terrible price, their humanity." The sisters went still, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara's eyes narrowed. "You've learned too much, Ethan Mitchell. Knowledge has a price in Dustwood Valley." The ground began to tremble, and in the distance Ethan heard his cattle begin to scream. Dark shapes emerged from the shadows between the trees, things that moved like women but weren't, their forms twisted and elongated in ways that defied nature. Helen raised her arms to the moon, her voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "The circle closes, the debt comes due, the price must be paid in blood or transformation." The air grew thick with power, making it hard to breathe. Ethan felt something trying to reach into his mind, attempting to reshape his thoughts, his very being. But Ethan had come prepared. From his coat, he drew the artifacts he'd discovered in Anna's research, sacred objects that had been hidden away generations ago by those who'd fought against the Dark Pact. The sisters hissed at the sight of them, taking involuntary steps backward. "Your power comes from this land," Ethan said. "But so does mine now. Anna's blood binds me to it just as your mother's blood binds you." The battle that followed would have driven any ordinary man mad. The sisters called upon powers that hadn't been seen in the mortal world for centuries. The earth split open, revealing glimpses of what lurked below, things that should never have seen moonlight. But Ethan stood his ground, wielding the ancient protections that Anna had died trying to understand. In the end, it wasn't violence that resolved the conflict, but understanding. As dawn approached, Ethan revealed the full truth he'd uncovered, that the sisters themselves were victims of a curse they didn't fully understand. Their mother hadn't willingly made the pact that transformed them. She'd been forced, and her daughters had inherited her burden. Together, as the sun rose over Dustwood Valley, Ethan and the sisters performed the ritual Anna had discovered, one of cleansing, not destruction. The dark power was drawn out of the land, released back to the depths from which it came. The sisters' inhuman aspects faded, leaving them truly human for the first time in generations. Clara wept mortal tears, Helen spoke plainly instead of riddles, and Frances's seductive power transformed into simple human beauty. The curse that had claimed so many lives, including Anna's, was finally broken. Dustwood Valley would remember its bloody history, but it would no longer be enslaved by it. Ethan stayed on at the ranch, helping the sisters adjust to their newfound humanity. In time, the valley became known not for its dark legends, but for the strange family that lived there. A widowed rancher and 3 sisters, all of them carrying the weight of history, but no longer crushed by it. And on full moon nights, they would gather to remember both what was lost and what was gained in the breaking of an ancient curse. The legend of Dustwood Valley changed, becoming a story not of revenge or destruction, but of redemption and healing. Ethan found purpose in protecting the very land he'd once feared, and the sisters learned that true power came not from dark pacts, but from the choice to embrace their humanity with all its flaws and beauty. As autumn settled over Dustwood Valley, The transformation of both land and inhabitants continued in unexpected ways. The ranch, once a place of darkness and foreboding, began to show signs of new life. Wild roses, unseen for generations, pushed through the hard earth near the old corral, their crimson petals a stark contrast to the dusty landscape that had given the valley its name. Ethan found himself drawn to Frances in ways he hadn't expected. Her humanity had brought with it a vulnerability that matched his own, and their shared experiences of loss, his of Anna, hers of her immortal nature, created an understanding deeper than words. They would often sit on the porch at dusk, watching the sunset paint the valley in colors that seemed impossibly rich, speaking of futures neither had dared imagine before. Clara, the eldest sister, took to recording their story in a leather-bound journal she'd purchased in Prescott. Her elegant script filled pages with their history, not just the curse and its breaking, but the centuries before, when their family had first settled in these lands. She wrote of ancient pacts made in desperation, of power that corrupted, and of the price paid by generations of women who came before them. Helen, meanwhile, discovered that her gift for riddles had transformed into something else entirely, a talent for healing that drew people from as far as globes seeking her remedies. Her knowledge of the land's plants and their properties, accumulated over centuries, now served to ease suffering rather than perpetuate it. The middle sister found peace in this new purpose, though sometimes she still spoke in metaphors that left visitors puzzled and intrigued. Word spread through the territories of the changes in Dustwood Valley. Where once travelers hurried through, avoiding eye contact and crossing themselves, now they began to linger. A community grew, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. Families built homes along the valley's edges, drawn by stories of fertile soil and healing waters that hadn't flowed in living memory. But the sisters and Ethan never forgot the price of their redemption. They maintained a small shrine near the old oak where Anna's spirit had appeared that fateful night, marking both her sacrifice and the breaking of the curse. Fresh flowers appeared there regularly, though no one ever saw who placed them. Some said it was Frances, paying respect to the woman whose death had ultimately led to her salvation. The ranch itself flourished under their combined care. Ethan's knowledge of cattle raising merged with the sisters' ancient understanding of the land. Their herds grew strong on grasses that seemed to spring from nowhere, and their reputation for fair dealing brought honest trade from Flagstaff to Yuma. The dark whispers that had once followed the sisters were replaced by respectful nods and warm greetings. As years passed, travelers would sometimes ask about the strange lights that could be seen dancing over the valley on full moon nights. The sisters would smile knowingly but say nothing, understanding that some mysteries were better left unexplained. These weren't the malevolent manifestations of their cursed past, but rather reminders of the thin line between the world they'd left behind and the one they'd chosen. Ethan eventually married Frances in a ceremony that blended traditional vows with elements of the old ways, honoring both their present and their past. The valley itself seemed to celebrate, blooming with wildflowers that hadn't been seen in a century. Their union symbolized more than just a marriage. It represented the final healing of the rift between the mortal and immortal worlds that had torn Dustwood Valley apart for so long. The legend of the three sisters evolved, becoming a story passed down through generations of valley residents. Parents would tell their children about the power of choice, of how three women chose humanity over power, love over immortality. And if sometimes, in the deepest part of night, strange songs could be heard echoing through the valley, well, that was just part of living in a place where magic had once ruled, and where its echoes still lingered in the wind's whisper and the earth's memory. Years later, Clara would write in her journal's final pages that true power wasn't in the ability to command forces beyond mortal understanding, but in the courage to embrace one's own humanity with all its limitations and possibilities. The curse that had defined their existence for centuries had become a blessing in disguise, teaching them the value of what they'd nearly lost, the simple, profound gift of being human.